from foreign workers, whether they live in the US or outside, going to
So,
help
how do we
workers
measure
here.
inflation?
Now, there are different indices for different purposes. For converting nominal GDP to real GDP, the government uses what's called the GDP deflator. And for consumers' cost of living, the government uses the Consumer Price Index. And these are both based on the same idea. You're going to pick a year or a period. Normally, we're talking a year at a time. You're going to pick, well, they do calculate this month to month. The point is, you're going to pick a period of time to look at, and you use that as your base month, your base year, whatever it may be. And then you pick a bundle of goods representative of normal expenses, and you measure the ratio of how much it increased. Often we like to use the metaphor of a shopping cart. If you imagine a typical shopping cart, a typical like week's worth of groceries and other household supplies, with a little bit of rent thrown in, with a little bit of utilities and so on and so forth. We're measuring the change in the shopping cart because the shopping cart has proportions for each good that are representative of a normal person's purchases. And the only difference between this GDP deflator and this consumer price index is that the GDP deflator is going to include things like raw materials and capital. It includes stuff that producers care about. The consumer price index is specifically for consumers, products that you would go and buy in a store. Now, example of this being calculated. Suppose your bundle in 2023 is 3 baubles, 2 gewgaws, and 1 gadget at $10, $20, and $5 each. And so in 2023, that should say, in 2023, the bundle will be $75. In 2024, the prices change. Baubles skyrocket to $15. Gewgaws actually fall to $16, and gadgets go up to $8. And so if we take the same amounts, 3 baubles at 15, 3 at 15, 2 at 16, and 1 at 8, then 15 times 3 plus 16 times 2 plus 8 comes out to 85. And then if you divide 85 by 75, you get 1.13. The inflation index for 2024 is 1.13. And this is basically telling you, if you want to buy the same goods in 2024, like if you were to spend $1 in 2023, it would take you $1.13 to get the same goods in 2024. And you would say that the inflation rate is 13%. So it's this thought experiment. How much money would I have to have now to buy the same things I used to be able to buy? Now, like measuring GDP, measuring inflation is going to be fraught with problems. The bundle people buys changes over time. It can change in part just due to changes in taste. Things come in and out of fashion. People want different kinds of products. For the most part, this isn't going to be a big deal because the bundle is abstract enough to account for that. They're targeting kind of broad categories of goods, and you don't see huge shifts in broad categories of goods. People don't suddenly develop a taste for a lot more housing or a lot more entertainment, for example. but it can be a lot more difficult to try to quantify changes in quality. You'll have an item that's more expensive, for example, but is it more expensive due to inflation or is it more expensive because it's better technology? So, with automobiles, for example, you can kind of make cases in either direction with those. Modern cars are a lot safer. Modern cars have a lot better mileage than they used to. A lot of modern cars have electronics built in. You know, they'll have little TVs in the back seats. They'll come with GPS maps built directly into it. They'll have the self-driving capabilities. Those are all things that your old cars didn't have. Biggest downside is that the old cars looked a heck of a lot better. So if you were to compare the price of a, Cadillac today to a Cadillac back in the day, you'd have to have some way of judging these differences. This modern product's a lot more expensive. I'm talking about when it would have been bought new, right? It's a lot more expensive, but it has all of this functionality that the old version didn't used to have. Same thing with things like phones. The smartphone market has gone completely insane. You've got Apple charging over $1,000 for a phone now. But the phones are genuinely a lot better. They didn't used to have CPUs that big. They didn't used to have GPUs that big. You didn't used to be able to use your phone like it was a little gaming computer. I remember my first smartphone equivalent was actually an iPod, and it had. So my first equivalent to a smartphone was this iPod. I don't remember what they called it, iPod Touch maybe. But the big idea was it had Wi-Fi. You could actually use the internet on it. It didn't have cell service, so that was actually very, very limited in usefulness. But it had Wi-Fi, and of course that was a huge innovation over the original iPod, which had no Wi-Fi at all, had no touch screen, was just a music player. That was it. The nature of a product can change dramatically over time. I don't think they even sell iPods anymore. But you have to have some way of dealing with that. If you want your inflation statistics to mean anything, you have to be able to try to put a dollar value on the improvements in the technology, because otherwise it's going to make inflation look a lot worse than it really is. The flip side of this is that sometimes products do get worse. I think usually when you talk about technology, it gets better. When you talk about manufacturers, it gets worse because you're buying Chinese garbage. Stuff isn't durable anymore. That's intentional in part. They call it planned obsolescence. They'll sell people something. Actually, Apple got dinged by the government over that, and they were artificially throttling their batteries' lifespans, make a thing wear out faster just so they can sell you the replacement. Well, a similar problem that you run into is when completely new products emerge. So products improve over time. For the most part, they improve over time. But sometimes you also get products that really just have no equivalent in the past. So for example, what would you consider a computer in 2000? Take a computer in 2000. What would be its equivalent in 1900? Are you going to compare it to an abacus because it's a calculating machine? Are you going to compare it to a newspaper because it provides, you know, access to information? Are you going to compare it to an entire private library? Is it equivalent to tickets at a playhouse because it puts on shows because you can stream movies on it? Is it equivalent to having a secretary? Is it equivalent to having an accountant because it can run Microsoft Excel? You see the problem. A computer is unique because a computer doesn't just perform a certain set of tasks. Its ability to do any of these tasks makes it more than just the sum of its parts. On the other hand, you might look back into the past, take things that we don't buy much of nowadays, and ask where they would fit in. Like for a horse, the obvious thing would be to equate a horse with a car. They're both transportation at the end of the day. But most people that are buying, you know, horses nowadays, they're not using them as transportation, they're using them as an entertainment good. And even just a change in perspective can change how we view a good. If you're trying to measure GDP in the distant past, do you compare organic food then to organic food now, or do you compare it to regular food now? Everything in the past used to be organic, but that didn't mean anything to them. It was organic because they didn't have inorganic, fertilizers yet. They wouldn't have put any value on it. There are ways that economists can try to get around this, and one of the main ways is through what's called chaining. You basically come up with a different index for each year. And then for every year, you take a weighted average of all the different indices. So you might say, well, we'll give a weight of 1 to this year's bundle of goods, and then we'll count at like 95% the next year's bundle of goods, and then so on and so forth. So that for every year, every other year gets a little bit of say, but it's weighted towards years that are closer. And that's one way that they do this because that allows for a sort of gradual shading. You know that the product mix has to change, you know that the quantity has to change. But that can help to smooth out some of the awkwardness of it. It's difficult to do correctly though. And in the end, a lot of growth economists, that's my main field. A lot of growth economists do economic history work where they'll have some data set and they'll say, oh, this was what the price level was back in ancient Rome, and this is what it is now. It's bullshit. Nobody knows. You can't meaningfully put together a data set that covers that much time. Inflation measurement works very well when you're comparing year to year. It's decent if you're comparing like from decade to decade. But I'd say when you go beyond 50 years, it all just kind of breaks down. It's not, I don't take any of that stuff seriously. Now, in the modern world, the price level is pretty much always going up. We're always inflating the currency. It wasn't always true. Under the gold standard and specie, deflation was common. Most of the time, population grew faster than the known gold reserves did. And so the currency would deflate, price levels would actually go down. In a modern age of cash and budget deficits, though, government doesn't let that happen. And so, because of this, nominal prices, wages, and GDP from before the base year are usually going to be understated, whereas nominal prices, wages, and GDP from after the base year will be overstated. right? If you're comparing everything to the base year, then before the base year, when the price levels are lower, that's going to make things look worse. Or if you're talking about prices, it would actually make it look better than it was. After the base year, it's going to make it look higher than it really is. And both of these problems are going to get worse the further you go back or forward in time. So you always want to use real statistics. Always, anytime you look up wages, GDP, prices, whatever it is you're doing it for, make sure that it's the real numbers. The nominal numbers don't mean anything. But I have an example of this here with GDP. This is from roughly 1950 to 2015 for the US. Red is your gross domestic product, nominal. If it doesn't say real, assume it's nominal. Blue is real. And so you see, looks like they're using 2012 as their base year. Before that point, the real GDP is higher than the nominal GDP because the prices were lower. So if you don't adjust for prices, it's going to make the economy look poorer than it was. But after 2012, after the base year, real GDP is lower than nominal GDP. If you didn't do the inflation adjustment, you would be over predicting. You'll also notice that with both of these, they're increasing over time. But with the nominal GDP, it looks like more of an exponential increase. With the real GDP, it's smoother. On the right-hand side, just to show you, we've got nominal wages and real wages. You see nominal wages keep shooting up and up and up. Way back in 1947, people are literally making $1 an hour. Nowadays, well, actually, that's 2002, so it's gone up even more since then. But about 20 years ago, making like 15 an hour. This is average across the whole country. But the real wage didn't move near as much. From the 50s, the 50s were kind of America's economic golden age. From the 50s up to the 70s, there was some really solid growth. Not quite a doubling of people's wages, but still, quite respectable. I want to draw your attention to the fact that that's zero at the bottom. So you're talking within living memory. My pa was born in 46. Within living memory, people are going from, $5 to around like $9. But then the 70s come and there was a very bad patch of inflation followed by globalization. Where does the growth go? American unions were at their high point in the 70s. The US had a very strong labor movement all the way from the New Deal up through the 70s. And America also had its own manufacturing back then. And there was no mass immigration. So workers had very little competition. And that meant that they got to reap most of the benefits of their own work. The 70s come, you get dramatic inflation. The 80s and 90s come, you get massive globalization. You get masses of illegals flooding in from the southern border. You get masses of factories flooding out of the country to exploit cheap Asian labor. I want to draw your attention to something here. Notice how the real GDP per capita continued to soar. See how it shot up? Oh, that's not per capita. That's just GDP. I wish I'd put GDP per capita there. Still, notice how the economy continued to expand massively over that period, yet regular folks' living standards didn't go up at all. Who'd it go to? It went to the rich. Rich grabbed it all up, and they used foreigners and deunionization to do it. If you're on the right wing, I want you to understand the death of the unions was also the death of the working class in this country. If you're on the left wing, think through it. Is more competition from foreign workers, whether they live in the U.S. or outside, going to help workers here? No.